The Choctaws are indigenous Native Americans who were part of the 5 civilized tribes, which included the Chickasaws, Creeks, Cherokees, and Seminoles. The Choctaw tribe has an interesting history dating to approximately 9,000 years ago, marked by their journey from distant regions to the fertile landscapes of present-day Southeastern America. This migration led to their eventual settlement in the Mississippi River Valley area, near the sacred mound Nanih Waiya, leading a sedentary lifestyle based on agriculture, hunting, and fishing. Throughout their history, the Choctaw people encountered various European groups, including the French, English, and American settlers, leading to gradual changes in their way of life. However, a major event that would change their lives forever occurred after welcoming the Americans with open hands. This event plunged them into a journey they would never forget, known as the Trial of Tears. Despite the challenges posed by colonization, which made them strangers in their land, they have created a story that inspires indigenous societies to thrive in adversity. Sit back as we take you on a journey to uncover the cultural history of the Choctaw Indians, spanning from the indigenous period to the present. While you're waiting to time travel, kindly like this video and hit the subscribe button for more content on thrilling histories worldwide. The origin of the Choctaw is not quite specific, as it involves a complex interplay of mythologies, legends, and archaeological research. This Muskogean-speaking tribe strongly believe in their origin, which they've passed down from generation to generation. According to legends, they journeyed for quite a long time from far northwest to finally arrive and settle at the sacred Nanih Waiya. As they traveled, a special leader called a Hopai took the forefront, carrying a sacred pole with utmost reverence. This pole was seen as a compass to guide them to their destination as they journeyed tirelessly. Every night, they planted the pole firmly in the ground, and in the morning, they observed which way it leaned. If the pole leaned left, they set out on that path. If it leaned right, they wasted no time journeying in that direction. Finally, like any other day, they planted the pole deeply into the ground, hoping to find a new direction. But the next day started a captivating era for the Choctaws. They woke up to find the pole standing tall, unbending and unmoving. This huge sign was seen as a divine answer, leading them to start their civilization. Here, they built their homes and the historic Nanih Waiya mound. Historians say the Choctaw ancestors journeyed to settle in the Mississippi River Valley about 7,000 BCE. They came from places that are now Mexico and parts of Western America. This was a slow process, with different groups of people moving over time. When they finally arrived in the Mississippi River Valley, they saw opportunities for expansion in the rich landscape. This area covered what we now call Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama. Now that we've examined the origin of this Native American tribe, let's critically look at how they operated their newfound society and built a strong culture. The clan system was an important aspect of Choctaw society, as a cornerstone of their social structure, identity, and relationships. Choctaw clans comprised extended families knit together by common ancestry and genealogy that traced back generations. This clan system started with the division of the Choctaws into 2 moieties, which are the Imaclashas, interpreted as elders, and Inhulalatas, interpreted as youths. These groups were further divided into about 12 clans, which were traditionally identified as Ixus. Marriage within a clan was considered taboo. Choctaw individuals were encouraged to marry outside their clan, reinforcing social ties and preventing close intermarriage among relatives. People were usually identified first by Imaclashas or Inhulalatas before they could talk about their Ixus. Due to the matrilineal nature of the Choctaw culture, children were identified based on the Ixus of their mother. The mother was seen as the giver of life. After the marriage ceremony, the husband lived with his wife's relatives, and their children belonged to her Ixus. However, the husband is still identified by his own maternal Ixus. The extent of maternal influence in society determines social status and position. Inheritance and property ownership also reflect the matrilineal nature of Choctaw society. While land and resources were often held communally, some forms of personal property, such as certain tools or personal items, might be passed down through the maternal line. Apart from the moieties, The Choctaw people were split into 3 sections, like districts. Each district had a leader called a Mingo, or principal chief, whom the men in that district chose. To be a chief, you needed to show that you were good at organizing things, had a strong military background, and came from a respected family. The Mingo had helpers called captains, who were more respected than the war chiefs. The Choctaws had a good and fair political system that worked excellently. This is a good time to chip in a fun historical fact about the Choctaw people. They believed so much in the sun and claimed that it held some sort of mystical power. Whenever the chiefs wished to discuss political matters, they critically observed the weather to determine whether the meeting should be held. If the weather were cloudy or rainy on the day of a meeting, the Choctaw would postpone the discussion, saying they needed more time to prepare. They believed that the sun ensured that all discussions were truthful and fair. The sun was seen as a symbol of immense power and respect, which was important in the cultures of Native American tribes in the southeastern United States. The Choctaw had special words for the sun that showed this respect. Words like anaphora meant the one who sees or witness, and hushtali, roughly interpreted as the governor of the world, whose eye is the sun, is proof of their reverence for the sun. The Choctaw people established their settlements across 6 distinct locations, further categorized into 3 major regions: Okla Fayala, Okla Hanali, and Okla Tanab. These places showed the depth of their precision in creating an adaptable and organized society. One skill that distinguished the Choctaws from their neighboring tribes was their excellent agricultural skill. They cultivated 3 major crops and birthed a new farming method called the Three Sisters farming. These crops include crops, beans, and pumpkin. The Three Sisters agricultural system was a sophisticated and sustainable farming practice employed by the Choctaw and many other indigenous tribes. It takes advantage of the benefits of the simultaneous cultivation of corn, beans, and pumpkin. Why is this farming method so special? Beans were planted alongside corn, and they acted as natural nitrogen-fixing plants, enhancing the soil's fertility and providing essential nutrients to the corn. This symbiotic relationship between corn and beans allowed higher crop yields and more efficient land use. Pumpkins, on the other hand, were also strategically planted to serve as a natural ground cover, creating shade and promoting moisture retention. They work well in preventing erosion and deter the growth of weeds. Now, of all crops, Choctaws relied heavily on corn as a major source of food supply. Both Choctaw stories and archaeological research tell us that corn was first grown in Mexico and gradually brought to North America. Around AD 1000, something big happened. Corn was popular and became the main food for Native American groups in the Southeast, including the Choctaws' ancestors. These peaceful and hospitable Native Americans lived their everyday lives comfortably and grew in population and strength. Before contact with the Europeans, their population was estimated to be about 20,000 people. Before we move to the next phase of Choctaw history, which led to a shocking shift in their lives, kindly hit the like and subscribe buttons if you haven't done so. The arrival of European explorers marked a turning point in the history of indigenous Native American people like the Choctaw. This period profoundly changed their way of life, culture, and society. Hernando de Soto, a Spanish explorer, embarked on an expedition in 1539, venturing into the southeastern region of North America. The goal was to find a rich and strange land, conquer it, and ultimately rule over it. During this journey, he and his men became the first Europeans to contact the Choctaw in 1540. The Choctaws gladly started trading with them, exchanging their agricultural products for metal tools, cloth, and firearms. However, this relationship was cut short when the Spaniards tried to bite more than they could chew. The problem began when De Soto captured Tuscaloosa, a Choctaw chief of the Moma Bina town, and kept him hostage. He demanded women, servants, and canoes. This unruly request triggered the Choctaws, which led to a bloody battle. However, the Choctaws pretended to be subservient to the Spaniards and agreed to give in to their demands. On the 18th of October, 1540, De Soto made his way into the town majestically. The Choctaws welcomed him and organized a feast for him. Little did he know that he had fallen into a trap. While he was enjoying the entertainment, the Choctaws suddenly launched an attack against the Spaniards. The fight got so bad that the Spanish explorers' train containing their supplies and gear burned up. Sadly, a part of the village was also burned down in the chaos. The battle then took a new turn when the Spanish suddenly came in with giant armored war horses that the Choctaw had never seen before. This left the Choctaws completely terrified. In the end, the battle took the lives of thousands of Choctaws. However, these Native Americans managed to take down about 22 Spaniards using bows and arrows. When the tough battle ended, the Europeans remained in the town for a while before crossing the Mississippi and moving on to their next expedition. The Choctaws never had contact with the Europeans until the 1700s. Before then, the Choctaws had fierce disputes with neighboring Indian tribes, particularly the Natchez Indians, in a bid to expand their territories. These disputes often revolved around control of hunting grounds, trade routes, and access to valuable resources such as fertile lands and game. The Choctaws allied with the French colonists, seeking an advantage in their ongoing conflicts with the Natchez. The alliance between the Choctaws and the French proved crucial in their efforts to gain an upper hand in the ongoing conflicts. Together, they launched an attack against the Natchez tribe, which left the Natchez people brutally defeated. By 1730, the Natchez tribe had been severely weakened, and their influence had dwindled significantly. Many Natchez individuals had been killed in the conflicts, while others were displaced from their lands, resulting in the tribe's decline and eventual non-existence. This marked the end of the Natchez as a prominent indigenous group. While the Choctaws lived peacefully for a while, a conflict arose which led to the painful Choctaw Civil War from 1747 to 1750. This conflict divided the nation, with one faction favoring exclusive trade ties with the French and another seeking relations with the English. In the end, many villages were emptied, and the Choctaws became very weak. Eventually, they realized that this fighting only helped the European people, so they made peace. The Civil War ranks one of the most catastrophic events in recorded Choctaw history. After the French left North America in 1763, following the Treaty of Paris, which brought the region under the control of the British, the Choctaws established ties with the British and the Spanish. During this time, the Choctaws became even better at dealing with the European colonial powers. They were careful and skilled in handling their relationships with these colonial nations, making them experts in politics. Then came the Revolutionary War between the American colonies and Great Britain, lasting between 1775 and 1783. The Choctaw people sided with the Americans and helped them greatly. Before the war, the Choctaws had interactions with British traders and officials. However, these relationships were not without tensions. The Revolutionary War allowed the Choctaw Nation to engage with the American colonists, who were fighting for their independence from British rule. They worked as scouts for American generals and even made peace treaties with the Americans in 1786. In 1801, the Americans got permission to build a road through Choctaw land. With the road's construction underway, the movement of Americans into Choctaw lands began to increase. Settlers, traders, and land speculators saw the road as an opportunity to access previously less accessible regions. As a result, more and more Americans ventured into Choctaw territory. As the American population in Choctaw lands grew, the demand for land rose. American settlers and government officials engaged in negotiations and agreements with Choctaw leaders regarding land transactions. These negotiations often led to treaties that required the Choctaw Nation to cede or sell portions of their ancestral lands to the United States. In 1805, during talks for the Treaty of Mount Dexter, the Americans started pushing the Choctaw people to move west of the Mississippi River. The United States sought to acquire Choctaw lands in the southeastern United States for American settlement and agricultural development. Despite the increasing pressure, the Choctaw leaders maintained a diplomatic and friendly approach towards the United States. This approach was likely influenced by previous interactions, including alliances during the Revolutionary War, which had fostered a sense of cooperation. Eventually, the Choctaw Nation ceded a significant portion of their ancestral lands to the United States in the year 1820. However, they retained over 10 million acres of their original homeland, east of the Mississippi River, refusing to move west. This treaty marked a notable instance of land loss for the Choctaw people. Despite the Choctaw Nation's earlier efforts to retain some of their homeland, a dramatic and tragic turn of events occurred in 1830 during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, who held office from 1829 to 1837. This pivotal moment in history is often referred to as the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, or the Choctaw Removal Treaty. Despite numerous petitions sent to Washington, D.C., denouncing the treaty as morally objectionable and unjust, President Andrew Jackson and the U.S. Congress approved the act. This legislation compelled the Choctaw and several other tribes to surrender their ancestral lands entirely and relocate westward. Despite the pleas of the Choctaw tribe, the treaty was fully implemented. The Choctaw removal, which followed the signing of the treaty, was a traumatic and grueling journey known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands of Choctaw people suffered immense hardship, loss of life, and displacement during this forced migration to their new lands west of the Mississippi River. Approximately 15,000 Choctaw people, including men, women, and children, were forcibly uprooted from their homes. The Choctaws faced brutal conditions during their journey. They were ill-prepared for the harsh winter weather, lacked proper clothing and shelter, and often went hungry. Many died from exposure, starvation, and disease along the way. The Choctaw Trail of Tears resulted in the loss of an estimated 4,000 lives, with some estimates suggesting an even higher death toll. The Choctaw Nation was fractured, and their communities were profoundly disrupted. An estimated 5,000 to 6,000 Choctaw individuals chose to stay in Mississippi, defying pressures like imprisonment and fines. As noted by Native American Studies historian Ronald N. Satz, those who remained in Mississippi after 1833 found themselves entangled in what he describes as one of the most egregious instances of deceit, coercion, and exploitation in American history. This unfortunate fate was a result of the Choctaw being perceived as an unproductive and burdensome population to the state. Choctaws who chose to stay despite being strangers on their own land tried to exercise a little faith. To avoid being removed, they relied on their rights outlined in Article 14 of the treaty, which stated, "Each Choctaw head of family, being desirous to remain and become a citizen of the states, shall be permitted to do so by signifying his intention to the agent within 6 months from the ratification of this treaty, and he or she shall thereupon be entitled to a reservation of one section of 640 acres of land, if they reside upon said lands intending to become citizens of the states for 5 years after the ratification of this treaty. In that case, a grant of land in fee simply shall be issued." However, this seemingly fair article had a dark side. William Ward, the federal agent responsible for collecting the names of those who claimed these rights, worked against the Choctaw. He physically destroyed their claims, removed names from his list, and even encouraged agents tasked with removal to punish any Choctaw who resisted leaving. As Ward obstructed the Choctaw from submitting their claims, they gradually lost their lands. The few Choctaws left hid in swampy areas, living secretly as refugees, until they were given a small piece of land near Philadelphia, Mississippi, in the early 1900s. In the West, which was known as the Indian Territory, the Choctaws established a government known as the Choctaw Nation. They organized their new territory, developed laws, and established a capital at Tuskahoma, presently located at northern Pushmataha County, Oklahoma, United States. Drawing on their rich agricultural traditions, they cultivated the fertile lands of Indian Territory with determination and ingenuity. Crops such as corn, cotton, and wheat flourished, contributing to the tribe's economic stability. Not long after the 1830s, Christian missionaries from various denominations trooped in, hoping to convert Choctaws to Christianity while providing Western education and humanitarian assistance. Some of the earliest Christian missions in Indian Territory were established by Baptist and Presbyterian groups. For example, the American Baptist Home Mission Society started mission work among the Choctaws in Indian Territory as early as 1832. In 1838, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions sent Presbyterian missionaries to the area. They established schools and churches with the intent of both religious conversion and education. Methodist missionaries were also active in the region. The Methodist Episcopal Church, South, had a significant presence among the Choctaw Nation. They established schools and churches, including the Wheelock Academy, which was a popular institution for Choctaw females. The Choctaws lived their lives peacefully for a while until the start of the American Civil War, which lasted between April 12, 1861 to May 26, 1865. The war started as a conflict between the North, also known as the Union, and the South, known as the Confederacy. The conflict centered around whether or not slavery should be allowed to spread into new areas out west. The North thought it should, which might create more states where slavery was legal. But the South wanted rules to stop slavery from spreading any further, thinking that would eventually make slavery disappear. Prior to their forced removal from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States, the Choctaw people had established relationships with southern states, particularly Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. These ties, which included trade and political alliances, made some Choctaw leaders rise up in support for the South. They also believed that aligning with the Southern cause was a means to safeguard their agricultural investments, including cotton plantations and related enterprises. These leaders may have seen the Confederacy as a more favorable environment for the preservation of their economic livelihoods. And of course, these views came with oppositions within the Choctaw tribe. One of the primary reasons some Choctaw leaders and members favored the Union was because they saw the United States as a more stable and established authority compared to the Confederacy, which was a newly formed entity. These Unionist Choctaws believed that remaining loyal to the United States offered a better chance of preserving their tribal lands and rights. As the war escalated, the Union, faced with the need to concentrate troops in other parts of the country, withdrew its military presence from Indian Territory, leaving the Choctaws and other tribes vulnerable to the negative impacts of the war. The conflict disrupted trade routes, making it difficult to obtain goods and supplies from neighboring regions. In response to their circumstances, the Choctaw Nation got united and entered into formal diplomatic relations with the Confederacy. This meant they recognized the Confederacy as a separate nation and sought alliances with Confederate forces. This decision was influenced by a combination of factors, including their vulnerability, grievances, and the belief that the Confederacy might provide them with a measure of protection and support. As a result of their diplomatic ties with the Confederacy, the United States government considered the Choctaws and other tribes in Indian Territory to be in rebellion against the Union. This happened after the Union emerged victorious. The following year after the war, the Choctaws once again entered into the famous Treaty of 1866 with the United Nations. This treaty was negotiated at a time when the United States was working to reintegrate the southern states and Native American nations into the Union following the end of the Civil War. The treaty recognized the sovereignty of the Choctaw Nation and acknowledged their right to govern themselves as a nation. In view of this, the Choctaws wasted no time in creating its own constitution, which was, however, very similar to that of the American Constitution. The assistance provided by the U.S. government contributed to the rebuilding of Choctaw communities, especially in the aftermath of the Civil War. This support helped the Choctaw Nation recover from the economic and social disruptions of the conflict and also protect Choctaw lands from further encroachments by settlers. One major impact of the Treaty of 1866 was that it allowed a railroad to be built through Choctaw land. This had a similar effect on the Choctaw Nation in the late 1800s, as when they allowed wagon roads in the early 1800s. It led to a large number of Americans moving into Choctaw territory. Despite the protections in the Treaty of 1866, the late 19th century saw increasing pressure on Native American tribes, including the Choctaws, to divide their tribal lands into individual allotments. In the late 19th century, the U.S. government thought that Native American tribes owning land together wasn't a good idea. They wanted each Native American to have their own piece of land instead, believing that this would help Native Americans become more like other Americans and fit into society better. The most significant piece of legislation that embodied the land allotment policy was the Dawes Act of 1887, also known as the General Allotment Act. This act authorized the President of the United States to break up tribal lands and assign individual allotments to tribal members. However, it backfired on the Choctaws. It resulted in the loss of significant portions of tribal lands. Many tribal members, who may not have been familiar with individual land ownership, lost their allotted lands due to factors like land sales and mismanagement. As the 20th century approached, there was a growing push for Oklahoma to achieve statehood. Now, recall that Oklahoma, located in the southern United States, was originally designated as Indian Territory, set aside by the U.S. government for the resettlement of various Native American tribes. This included the Choctaw Nation, which had been forcibly removed from its ancestral lands in the southeastern United States to Indian Territory in the 1830s. Many factors contributed to this push for statehood, including the desire for economic development, the need for established law and order, and the goal of integrating the region into the broader United States as a full-fledged state. The Enabling Act of 1906, passed by the U.S. Congress, provided the legal framework for Oklahoma to pursue statehood. This act authorized the people of Oklahoma Territory to draft a constitution and form a state government. In November 1906, a constitutional convention was held in Guthrie, Oklahoma Territory, to draft a state constitution. Delegates from both Oklahoma Territory and Indian Territory participated in the convention. The resulting constitution was ratified by the voters in Oklahoma Territory and, separately, by the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations in Indian Territory. On November 16, 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt issued a proclamation that formally admitted the state of Oklahoma into the Union. This marked the end of the separate territories of Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory, and Oklahoma became the 46th state of the United States. Therefore, Choctaw citizens and members of other tribes residing in Oklahoma became citizens of the state, subject to state and federal laws. Choctaw citizens gained the right to participate in Oklahoma's political processes. They could vote in state elections and potentially hold positions in state and local government. The Choctaws, who refused relocation but chose to remain in Mississippi, had sadly become strangers in their own land. Around the early 1900s, there were only about 253 Choctaw people left in Mississippi. Young Choctaw individuals had limited options for their future. There was no official tribal government, and very few Choctaws owned land. Not many schools were available to Choctaw kids, and most of them had to work in fields with their parents. For many years after they were forced from their homeland, Choctaws mainly worked as sharecroppers. They didn't have good access to education or health care. The Choctaws' difficult life, lack of schooling, and health problems made the U.S. Congress send a group to check on them. The report from this group said that the Choctaws were living in the poorest pocket of poverty in the poorest state in the country. So, in 1918, the Bureau of Indian Affairs created the Choctaw Indian Agency in Philadelphia, Mississippi. This agency was meant to start schools and improve the health of Choctaw people with an approved budget of $1,000. Even after the Choctaw Indian Agency was set up, the tribe still didn't have its own officially recognized government. It wasn't until the Federal Indian Reorganization Act of 1934 that the Choctaws got a government of their own. Before that, for almost 50 years, American Indians were expected to become like non-Indians. Some tribal members were elected to a temporary tribal council. They advised the agency superintendent. But unlike the modern tribal council, this temporary council was limited in power. In 1944, the Choctaws sent a constitution to Washington, D.C. The U.S. government then recognized the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians in 1945. After accepting the Constitution, the temporary council organized an election to pick an official council. Joe Chitto from the Standing Pine community became the first council chairman. The 16-member council was chosen by the Choctaw people to serve 2-year terms, and they picked the chairman from among themselves. By then, the Choctaw Indian Agency had elementary schools in most Choctaw communities and had built a hospital in Philadelphia for tribal members. In the 21st century, the Choctaw people have continued to evolve and adapt to the contemporary world while preserving their cultural identity and heritage.